The series was created on March 25th, 1994 with the release of The Elder Scrolls Arena. Predominantly under the development of game director Vijay Lakshman, Ted Peterson and Julian LaFay, this new Elder Scrolls series acted as a change to what Bethesda were known for at that time. Bethesda were mainly making sports games in the Wayne Gretzky series and other Terminator games as well. A step into the large-scale fantasy RPG genre was one that was seen as too ambitious for the company. The game's director Vijay Lakshman went as far as to say that colleagues in the industry were literally laughing at us for thinking that we could do it. Arena was a first-person, procedurally generated open-world fantasy role-playing game that was heavily influenced by other games in the industry like Ultimate Underworld and other pen-and-paper role-playing games. The Elder Scrolls' maiden voyage was originally cited as an arena combat game with side quests, but the scope grew and grew from that point onwards, and the importance of the side quests became much more important to the development. The decision was then made to drop the idea of the arena to focus on quests, dungeons, and making the game into a full-blown RPG set on the entirety of the continent of Tamriel. When the game came to release, however, the initial sales were very disappointing, and the Bethesda developers were worried that the company was going to go out of business. However, due to positive reviews praising the game's 3D graphics and the amount of side quests, it encouraged more people to go out and buy it, which is exactly what happened, and the game sold enough to warrant a sequel. While Arena was very much developed around the world and how the player explored that world, Daggerfall was much more about improving how the player plays their character. Whilst the world building elements remained very similar to Arena, a new skill based system and enhanced character customization was introduced to take the role playing elements of the series to the next level. The game was still built around the idea of procedural generation as was Arena, and the total size of the game is approximately 160,000 square kilometers with a population of 750,000 NPCs, so Daggerfall remains to have the largest Elder Scrolls world to date. In order of the setting, however, the game was set only around the Iliac Bay region of High Rock and Hammerfell to the northwest of Tamriel, whereas Arena was set on the entirety of the continent. Around 120,000 copies were shipped to stores for Daggerfall's release, which shows the growth in comparison to 3,000 copies for Arena's release just 2 years prior. Positive reviews seem to follow as well, winning PC Gamer's best role-playing game in 1996, however it wasn't all sunshine and daisies in terms of reviews. And many reviewers had issues with the amount of bugs that Daggerfall released with, something that the Bethesda community started to mod the game in order to remove some of these bugs that were still there once Bethesda's official support of the game came to a close. It can be argued and been seen by many on the forums that the seeds of Bethesda's modding community were planted shortly after the release of Daggerfall. Battlespire was the first of 3 Elder Scrolls projects that were produced simultaneously by Bethesda shortly after the release of Daggerfall. Battlespire was very much a smaller scale Elder Scrolls game in comparison to the 2 that came out previous to it. There was no merchants to buy from, there was the lack of a rest feature for the character, and enemies were not reset in areas once they were killed. They were also not randomised. Battlespire was a commercial failure, with reviewers noting its less expansive scope, hack-and-slash gameplay and technical problems ultimately provide a role-playing experience that is only occasionally satisfying. Redguard was the second of the 3 Elder Scrolls games made after the development of Daggerfall, and was the first Elder Scrolls game of many things. It was the first Elder Scrolls game played entirely in third person, the first Elder Scrolls game where you play as a set protagonist, and was the first Elder Scrolls game under the direction of Todd Howard. Redguard was very much inspired by Tomb Raider and the Prince of Persia series, as you played as Cyrus on the Hammerfell island of Stros Mackay in a pure action-adventure game where you tackle puzzles and enemies in order to complete an epic story. Redguard was the first game to be made through handcrafted development techniques rather than ones made of procedural generation. The changes in the series, however, proved to be a poor financial choice for Bethesda, and the game was seen like Battlespire to be a commercial failure. While the game did have its cult following at the time, it's definitely not held in the same regard as the Elder Scrolls game that came after. Set on the island of Vardenfell in the country of Morrowind. Morrowind was the start of a new era for Bethesda and the start of what some call the Holy Trinity of Elder Scrolls games. Abandoning a procedurally generated world for one with handcrafted development, scrapping the X engine to Gamebryo, and the coming of improved technology in the new systems for the player base allowed Todd Howard and his team to create a much more in-depth world with no loss for detail that can rival the best of the RPGs at that time. The world became the main character. Development focus went to making the world feeling like an alien world, a world where you felt like a stranger in. A day and night cycle, rich landscapes and realistic weather effects made the world feel, well, real. Bethesda took the brief areas of lore that was in the first two installments and expanded it heavily into ones where the player base can thoroughly explore in the game and debate about it further on the online forums. Character creation was back, dice roll combat system reliant on the player's skills, and a free world to explore allowed the game to be a true RPG. Todd has frequently cited that the failures and the mistakes the company made with Battlespire and Redguard allowed them to make the Morrowind game the game that it was. The first Elder Scrolls game as well to have a soundtrack composed by Jeremy Soule, a person whose effect on the series definitely makes us feel the most amount of nostalgia. You know, the feeling when you get when you hear this playing. Morrowind, like Daggerfall and Arena, was not dependent on you completing the main quest. The world was at your leisure to explore. Vardenfell and the Dunmer treated the player differently to any other Elder Scrolls game, in the sense that you weren't really welcome there, you were the visitor they did not want to enter. Morrowind was an outstanding success for Bethesda, and one they were really relying on due to talks before the game came out that this was their last shot of being a success, and thankfully was, with over 300,000 sales in its first year. The game reviewed phenomenally well, with reviewers citing its breadth of scope, richness of visuals, and freedom it worked into its design. Glitches and bugs were still an issue, however. The modding community on PC did a lot of work to help deal with these issues after the game. But the community also produced a vast amount of mods, ranging from graphical improvements to new areas of land and quest lines. The success Bethesda had in establishing a hardcore community allowed them to make two expansions for Morrowind. Tribunal released on November 6, 2002 that took us to the Morrowind capital of Mournhold, and Blood Moon released on June 3, 2003 that focuses on a werewolf questline and took us to the island of Solstheim, northwest of Morrowind. These are a series of phone games made by Virtual Studios and released across 2003 and 2004. Elder Scrolls Travel Stormhold came out on August 1, 2003 and brought back procedural generation in its dungeons. It was set in the city of Stormhold in Blackmarsh. Elder Scrolls Travel's Dawnstar released on August 26, 2004 and was similar in the style to Stormhold, but instead it was set on Dawnstar in the country of Skyrim. Elder Scrolls Travel's Shadowkey was set across the southwest region of Skyrim and northeastern area of Hammerfell, and it introduced co-op of 1 to 4 players through the use of Bluetooth. The games, however, reviewed poorly, citing the poor limitations of the systems they were on. While these games were releasing, the anticipation were building for Bethesda's next introduction into the Elder Scrolls series, hoping that it would not disappoint. The fourth Elder Scrolls game brought us a cataclysmic event that brought to the end of the Third Era, the Oblivion Crisis. Gates brought down to the game setting Cyrodiil dragged the player into a plane we had only heard whispers of before, the realm of Oblivion. Production on Oblivion began right after the release of Morrowind on the next generation hardware of the console, the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and with this a desire to make the world larger and brighter than what Morrowind was, and Cyrodiil was the answer. Greatly impacted by the release of the Lord of the Rings films, having an accessible medieval RPG was something that Bethesda believed the market would be yearning for, and they weren't wrong. In order to make the series more accessible to developers, they decided to make the game series entirely voice acted, and some big names came along with it, Sean Bean and Patrick Stewart to name a few. Development of the world took on a different path. Procedurally generated forest was an angle the team went on. NPC AI was greatly improved as characters were designed to make choices rather than follow scripted routines. The game was a gigantic success for Bethesda, selling over 3 million copies in its first year alone, and receiving a slew of Game of the Year awards from critics who particularly praised the world of Tamriel and how the freedom of exploration kept you invested in the game. The success warranted 2 major expansions for Oblivion, Knights of the Nine and the Shivering Isles. The notorious Horse Armor DLC was also released post-launch. The Elder Scrolls series did not stop growing, but fans had to watch while Bethesda took a break from the series to make Fallout 3. But when that was done, the 5th installment was certainly in production. Skyrim is undoubtedly the most successful Elder Scrolls game to date. Taking the clean and generic fantasy world of Cyrodiil and changing it into the rugged Viking-like terrain of Skyrim is another sign of how Bethesda uses a different style of open world setting to be the main character. Dungeons were no longer procedurally generated, taking the handcrafted elements they use for the world and implementing them into the deep areas of Skyrim greatly enhanced the general gameplay flow of the series. Technological improvements allowed Bethesda to bring in a creature they wanted to bring in for several test games: dragons. As the Dragonborn, the lore of the dragons was certainly the main aspect of the game, specifically diving into their culture and learning their language. Bugs became a bigger problem for Bethesda though. While it's arguable there wasn't any more bugs in Skyrim as there was in previous test games, the ones in Skyrim were definitely talked about more and seen more due to capture cards and the rise of social media. Jeremy Soul's soundtrack still echoed throughout Tamriel, this time in Skyrim, and this time was influenced by some of the songs on the Morrowind soundtrack and by old Nordic hymns. Skyrim was a ginormous success from the off, selling over 20 million copies worldwide to this point. It's no surprise to hear for anyone that there was many versions of Skyrim that has since been released. Remastered versions, Game of the Year editions, VR versions, Switch ports. The popularity of the game is no surprise to anyone. 2 DLCs for expansions were warranted for the game's major success. The Vampire DLC Dawnguard released on June 26, 2012, and the Dragonborn DLC that brought us back to the island of Solstheim released on December 4, 2012. After Skyrim's success, it was a disappointment for some to hear that BGS were taking a break from the series to make Fallout 4, Fallout 76, and the recently announced new IP, Starfield. Yet the series would not drift into people's memories, as it was time to take the series online. ZeniMax Online Studios took on the daunting task of taking the traditional single-player RPG series into the MMO genre. A gargantuan task that has certainly been on a rocky road until getting to the point the game is at to date. The development of ESO has arguably been the most interesting to spectate from afar. Set on the entirety of Tamriel is every test fan's wet dream. But launching with a rubber-banding leveling system, floaty combat and static NPCs took what people loved about the series in the single-player games and bastardized it. However, the game has only got better and better with every passing day. The One Tamriel update allowing players to fully explore the world at their leisure rather than kettling them into a leveled zone, and several other updates bringing the game into a more traditional test experience rather than the one we got at launch. It's hard to argue that people were skeptical of ESO at first. Having a test with no first person was certainly an unpopular choice, but ZOS took the correct steps in changing this to give the player the choice of both perspectives. Originally launching with a $60 fee for the game, but also with the archaic $15 monthly subscription fee in order to remain as an active player, was again an unpopular decision. While this was dropped not long after in the Tamriel Unlimited release of the game, it's hard to suggest the traditional test fan was happy with the business decisions ZeniMax were making. However, the game turned out to be a fantastic financial success by selling more than 10 million copies as of 2017, and it's also right to suggest that the test community have been happy with how the game has turned out given time. Countless updates have been given to ESO, but so far 2 major expansions have been released. One that took us back to Vvardenfell in the Morrowind expansion on January 31st, 2017, and one that took us to the main island of the Somerset Isles, Somerset, to explore more into the Sigil Order on March 21st, 2018. The next major expansion is coming out on June 4th, 2019, where Elsewhere is going to be playable in the up-and-coming Elsewhere expansion. This will also bring dragons back to an Elder Scrolls story as a part of the Season of the Dragon expansions. Another step into a new genre for the Elder Scrolls series, this time developed by Direwolf Digital and into the collectible card genre. A free-to-play game that's very much centred around its competitive scene, while Legends doesn't entice the traditional test player, it certainly has its cult following that have dragged in 4 expansions to the game. Fan tournaments are regularly played on Twitch and has attracted former esports players of Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone to partake. As we know so far, the Elder Scrolls has spanned across several genres and many a platform, and the future looks the same for the series. Expansions will continue to support the Elder Scrolls Online as part of the Season of the Dragon over the course of the next 12 months. A new Elder Scrolls game in the Elder Scrolls Blades is set to be released in 2019 that will be playable on phones, PC, consoles and VR. But it's hard to deny that the most anticipated for the future of the series lies with the Elder Scrolls 6. Promised to be coming after BGS released their new IP Starfield, it leads us to expect the game to come in a few years yet, but the excitement certainly hasn't died down for the single player games in the series. In a series that has took us through the chasms, dungeons and plateaus of Tamriel, many an adventure has been partaken both alone and together. Tamriel is ripe with lore, quests and character. Exploring of the landscape is something that we all look forward to, and doing more so in the future. Whilst many of us still play regularly the old games, the future of the series and the unknown possibilities of the future of the franchise certainly both excite and worry us, but by all means Tamriel will still be there to be explored. Thanks a lot for watching, and here's to another 25 years of the Elder Scrolls.